having a good time so far? It's been a great book fest. My name is Anneliese Singh. I use she and they pronouns, and it's an honor to moderate today's panel. I do want to start by just reading their bios. I think words are important, and the work you have both done with your lives thus far has been pretty incredible. So Emmeline Clein is a writer and a Columbia MFA graduate. Her criticism, essays, and reporting have explored the intersection of disordered eating, diet culture, and contemporary feminism, blending history, cultural criticism, and memoir. With a lifetime of personal experience fighting an eating disorder and consuming the literary, filmic, televised, and online content, propagating our destructive cult of femininity, defined by slenderness, she has also spent years studying disordered eating's culture, epidemiology, and diagnostic history academically, and writing about these issues in memoir, essays, and investigative reporting. Let's give Emmeline another round of applause. Welcome back home to New Orleans. Her family's here. Where's her family? Let's give them some love, too. Yeah. I'm a New Orleanian, so, we got to do that. Dr. Lisa Wade, I'm always in awe of your work, so it's an honor to be here with you today. As an associate professor of sociology and gender and sexuality studies program at Tulane, in 2017, she published the groundbreaking book called American Hookup, The New Culture of Sex on Campus. The text situates collegiate hookup culture within the history of sexuality, the evolution of higher education, and the unfinished feminist revolution. Wade maps out a punishing emotional landscape marked by unequal pleasures, competition for status, and sexual violence. She discovers that privileged students tend to enjoy hookup culture the most and considers its effects on racial and sexual minorities, students who opt out, and those who participate ambivalently. Thank you both for writing these books. I told you before the panel that reading them side by side was such a powerful experience for me, making me think about who's actually in charge of our lives. Is it us? Is it individuals? Or is it the media? So let's get started. Emmeline, just congrats on your book. It just came out.
Yes, it did at the end of February.
More applause, more applause.
Okay, well, thank you.
It's like 2024. It's fresh off the presses. You open your book kind of telling the reader that this book falls into the category of memoirs of disordered eating, but you also situate yourself a little differently. You say, in the eating disorder memoirs, the girl recovers, but she often still wants us to know how close she got to the ultimate finish line. In so many of these stories, she blames her sisters for sending her there, teaching her their tricks and comparing limbs in high school hallways and then in hospital wards. The only way to survive seems to be renouncing your suffering sisters, transfiguring them into mean girl villains or naive, vain illness vectors. I'm trying to figure out what might happen if we blame someone other than each other and ourselves for a change. Can we all take a deep breath there? Tell me why you wrote this book.
Wow, big question. So there were many reasons. I mean, I started struggling with disordered eating when I was really young, and was not able to recover fully due to any normative medical treatment, but through a lot of self-education about the kind of political history of these diseases, and also through a lot of really supportive conversations with other women who had struggled with these issues, and that process was over a decade long, right? And so I actually, when I first thought about writing this book, I thought I wanted to write a book about female hysteria and sort of what was it historically and what is it now? Who is it? Is it me? Is it Misha Barton? Who's it going to be? And then as I started doing my research, I realized that a lot of the figures, both in the Victorian era and in modern times, that were sort of falling into this hysteria category were also struggling with a lot of disordered eating symptoms. And then I started trying to look for a book that really treated disordered eating as kind of a seminal microcosm of a lot of our kind of political structures, cultural forces, and economic changes that we've seen over the past, century, because I realized that any disease with the sort of demographic prevalence and fatality rates that eating disorders have, which are very disturbingly high and very disturbingly prevalent, get understood. So diseases like opioid addiction or depression or alcoholism get understood yes, as clinical illnesses, but also as microcosms of all of those structures, right? And the sufferers of those diseases have access to a lot of resources that reveal the structural issues that have caused their diseases in a way that can relieve blame, whereas eating disorders are generally treated in literature, either in the memoir, pure memoir genre, or the self-help genre, or the academic genre, all of which sort of trace this one very linear narrative of eating disorder and of eating disorder recovery that is one centering usually a very thin white girl who does not represent the demographic prevalence of this disease and who also has this kind of just very specific and sort of narrow narrative, as narrow as the beauty ideal, about both how the illness manifests and the recovery. And that story often pits women against each other, both in making people who don't fit that beauty ideal or that narrative of the sickness feel like they're not sick enough or feel excluded from a community that could breed solidarity, and also because there's so much sort of misunderstanding of these diseases and of their sufferers that can make people feel like girls are making each other sicker when they're just being honest about the society they live in, or like trigger each other, or whatever. And so I wanted to say, you know, I've read so many memoirs about eating disorders that I used as a manual, and even if that's not what the author intended, and I've seen so many books that cast girls that are in pain because they are reading a room they've been locked into correctly and understanding the beauty standard that they're getting from all sides, and so they're developing a coping mechanism that is also a disease, but then are being told that they're just crazy and overvaluing thinness and et cetera. And I wanted to say to those people, you know, you're not crazy, and this is a sort of sororal story and a collective memoir, and I kind of wanted to just amplify and attend to stories of disordered eating that don't fit into that narrow narrative, but to also kind of deconstruct that narrative and ask how it got seeded into our synapses so deeply. And now I'm rambling, but that's sort of what I was
I
trying to
don't think
do.
you're rambling. I really, if you haven't gotten this book, please get it, because I think one of the most powerful things is that you're flipping the script and you're calling media in. Facilitated a talk with Dr. Bettina Love yesterday, and she talked about this concept of the super predator and who actually is the super predator. And I think it's one thing I really took away from your book is the pitting of women against one another, but also like the deflecting away from the media. Lisa, in your book, American Hookup, The New Culture of Sex on Campus, you bust some myths as well that we've all grown up when it comes to the media, that everyone is having, in college, is having sex and enjoying it. And I think through your research, you find something different, and I wanted to read from the beginning of your book. You say, bringing it all together, I make a case for why hookup culture makes so many students unhappy. I offer an anatomy of the hookup and explain where it came from and why it dominates the college setting. I show what it feels like to opt in or opt out, and for those who choose to participate, I discuss what they're in for, the emotional landscape of hookup culture, politics of its pleasure, punishing expectations of physical perfection, intimidating games of status, and possibly of becoming the victim or the agent of a sexual crime. Tell us why you wrote this book.
Thank you. I'd love to. And before I do, I just want to say that Emmeline's book is really, truly amazing. It's so
you.
good. The expertise, the breadth of knowledge, the way she weaves together memoirs into this meta-memoir that is also extremely analytical and insightful.
Thank you.
Okay, so I was teaching classes in the sociology of sexuality, and I was listening to my students talk about hookup culture. I was really, lucky to be kind of at the front of that and being able to hear their stories. And I was also paying attention to pop cultural sort of coverage of hookup culture. I noticed a couple things that really didn't jive with what I was hearing. One was, in the same way, the person that was always sort of centered in these pop cultural analyses was this very conventionally attractive heterosexual white middle class or upper class girl. And then the conversations around her were always like, should she or shouldn't she be involved in hookup culture? And then the answers would always be something like, someone would jump in and say, well, she should, because that's what liberation looks like. And then someone would jump in and say, no, she shouldn't, because it'll make her unhappy. She'll be harmed. And then there was a third person that would jump in and say, stop telling women what to do. And as a sociologist, with access to a diverse group of actual college students, I felt like I could offer a couple things. And one was a more diverse tale of what was really going on. And then instead of asking, should she or shouldn't she, I wanted to ask, like, what's the context in which students are making these decisions? And so I really focused in on trying to tell the story of what is this culture that so many students enter when they get to residential colleges, and tell that story instead, which I think was very humanizing. And I also am so lucky to have had 101 students submit diaries for this book. So I was able, the students themselves were so insightful, so funny, so lovable. And once I got the first batch of diaries, I got 3 batches, I knew I had something really special, and I really wanted to give them a platform.
Awesome. And this title of the session is Social Media and Image. Emmeline, you have a chapter in your book that explores some of this, titled Starving in Cyberspace. And I'm reading from their books because I just want you to hear their words. And there's every word is so beautiful and powerful. After the search bar, 2 paths diverge in the dark. Down one, pain and potentially dire straits, spiky shoals of self-hatred and self-harm, but also love, care, shared secrets, girls who get you. A place where no matter how sick and sad you are, someone will say, same. Down the other, girls who got off the other road before it careened off a cliff. Pain too, but also a life where picking up a fork doesn't have to mean a fork in the road. A life like you've lived before, back when you and your body were on speaking terms. So tell us more about kind of that paradox that exists within media and social media, and how this shapes kind of the image you have of yourself.
That's a great question. I mean, that chapter was actually so pivotal for me in this project of sort of shifting the frame, much as you were saying, sort of from the super narrow narrative of the one victim we've been talking about and what went wrong in her decision-making process, and saying instead sort of what are the structural forces and specifically the systems and corporations that are profiting from her hating herself in a very specific way that makes her behave in the next very specific set of ways. And so something that I found was that, like, I was sort of thinking back to these sort of pro-ANA, pro-eating disorder forums that I had frequented during my own disordered eating in sort of this like aughts era and early 20-teens. And what I found to be so interesting and paradoxical about both those spaces and the way that they were framed by the media at the time is that these were spaces that, like, for those of you that were online and using those spaces at the time, or also just like reading mainstream media, they were places where people were posting like diet plans for their eating disorders and sharing the like images that would inspire them for their eating disorders, but they were also places where people were going in like an extreme vacuum of care for eating disorders that do not fit that extremely narrow body standard. So like you have eating disorders are the only disease in the DSM that has a biometric demand. You can't get an anorexia diagnosis if you're not a certain amount of thin. And so people that are being rejected from treatment spaces are finding each other online to come up with harm reduction plans and to help each other and to also validate each other and say, you know, you are like, I'm so sorry this is happening to you, right? And to like help each other get through the days. That whole side of those websites was like completely ignored. But if you were reading like the New York Times in like 2008 or 2009, you'd often be coming across a article that would be like, teenage girls invent crazy new cult called being thin. And they're getting each other sick with these terrifying photos they're posting and really dangerous diet plans. And these articles, like, I'm not exaggerating, they were incredibly cruel, incredibly condescending. And there was no acknowledgement of the fact that most of what these girls were posting were diets they cribbed straight from the pages of like tabloids, of women's magazines, and put alongside photos that they had taken from tabloids and from women's magazines. So like, yes, these girls were coming up with like funny portmanteaus for a diet, but like they came up with inspiration, which isn't like my favorite word I've ever heard, but they're just like making a joke. Anyway, they're doing all of that, and then they're being hugely demonized in the media, cast in this way, like as their patient zero of a moral panic, and there's no acknowledgement that a series of adults in high-rise buildings signed off on all of those diets originally and those photos originally, and that now they can make money from not just publishing the diets, but also, and from publishing the stories about inspirational celebrity weight loss, but also from publishing sensationalized stories about teenage girls that are obsessed with dangerous celebrity weight loss.
Yes.
And so that is one thing where I was like, girls are being caught in a trap that is like just really constrictive and dangerous, and they're then finding each other online, and then when they do that, they're being censored. And so a lot of those spaces were censored because the social platforms just didn't want to take on the liability of the dangerous things being platformed on their spaces. And so there's like really tragic stories of people that would like make a thread on Reddit after their like self-harm board got banned, and they'd say like, you know, my like as a brown person in a larger body who like would never get diagnosed with an eating disorder and was never able to like get validated by the medical establishment, now my one space of support has been banned by Tumblr so that they can avoid a lawsuit. And so all of that was just like really sad, and I wanted to give those spaces sort of a tender treatment that also validated their intellect, because also these teen girls were often being cast as just like truly like vain idiots when in fact they're very literate and caring. But then on the flip side, like we had all of that happening in like the aughts, and now we see much more algorithmically generated social platforms where like to get onto one of those pro-eating disorder boards where you're going to get indoctrinated into the dangerous cult. In fact, the studies show that you don't usually even find those boards until you've been suffering for like at least a year. And so people who had already were ill, and I know that was my experience, find these spaces. It's not like you're just stumbling across it, right, and learning about a dangerous new thing. But today, that is actually happening, and yet we're not talking about it. Like with TikTok's For You page and with Instagram's Discover page, those algorithms are coded in such a way that presents young girls who actually aren't typing those words into the search bar and aren't seeking it out with really intense both diet content and eating disorder content. And I also think that the media obsession with parsing apart this like false line between just like a normal healthy diet and like disordered eating, which they're like going too far language that like implies you start off on the right track as you should be trying to lose weight, you just shouldn't lose too much. Whatever, all of this stuff is being fed, pardon the pun, to young girls in a really crazy way. Like if they did WSJ did an investigation that showed that if you just code a bot as a 13-year-old girl and she doesn't even search anything about weight, they're like, okay, 13-year-old girl, let's try out some weight loss content. And then if she doesn't scroll past fast enough, she's very quickly getting things that are called like the corpse bride diet. And so that is all being funneled to her while creators in larger bodies and creators of color are being actively shadow banned, and none of that is getting any of the type of media treatment that the teen girls who are just on a small forum with a few hundred people talking about their issues were getting as in terms of. And so I really wanted to sort of like shine a light on what these false notions we have about how teen girls are behaving and how their self-loathing that they've been taught by this society is or is not being ventriloquized into their interactions with other girls. And then I also wanted to sort of like shift the frame for today and say like, people aren't even being allowed the space to find their own communities or to decide how they understand themselves because they're being funneled into these like very whirlpool-y algorithms.
Well, and I think that's what I really appreciate is that you do turn the tables, you hold accountability, you call people in and out. And I'm a counseling psychologist that has worked mostly with Black and brown folks who have survived disordered eating. And I don't know, that word tender you used earlier, I don't know if y'all feel it as she talks and as I've read her words, like, it's just that tenderness is, I think, what you're gifting us with your memoir is that not just I see you, but I really see you and it's okay, I'm gonna believe you. And that's such a first step to healing, is being able to hear people's story from beginning to end with a middle, with emotion all the way through about what you're surviving in the outside world. So thank you. Lisa, you talk about social media and image in your book as well. I want to read, you say students go back to their rooms after brunch to edit and upload photos and stories to social media. I think a lot of this was a participant, I think a lot of our hookup culture and party culture is glamorized, wrote one student, referring to sites like Instagram and Facebook. A big part of these parties, another explained, is also taking mobile pictures, and their sole purpose is so one's whole social network can see that one is having a great time at college. What is the challenge when things like this are so glamorized?
Maybe you all have heard about the sex recession, that young people aren't having as much sex as the two previous generations, which appears to be a little bit true. And I often get asked about, well, how does that jive with the observation of hookup culture on college campuses that suggests that all these young people are having tons of sex with lots of people? And the truth is that something can be culturally normative and also actually quite unusual or rare. Like, for example, it's culturally normative in our society to grow up, graduate from high school, get your college degree, get yourself a nice job, maybe meet someone you like, get married, buy a house, get a dog, have a kid, stay married forever, right? But most people don't do it that way. There's all kinds of other ways, right? You might get the dog before the house. You might have the kids before the marriage. You may not stay together, right? It's actually that particular narrative that is quite culturally dominant is not normal. And the same thing is happening with hookup culture. There's this idea that everyone should be having sex all the time with all kinds of people. And about a third of students don't do it at all, not even a single time. And then most students, the plurality, they do it a little bit. And then they're like, I'm not sure I love this. About 10, maybe at max 15%, best thing that ever happened to them. They love it. So it doesn't have to be totally normative for it to be culturally dominant. And so that's what we see on college campuses. So hookup culture is actually quite consistent with a sex recession. And I would argue it's causing the sex recession because it says that the only way to have sex, because the relationship script is off the table on college campuses, so the only way to have sex is to have the sort of stones to like go ahead and have it for the first time often with someone you barely know under circumstances that are sort of chaotic. And a lot of students just don't have the stomach for that kind of environment, especially because these kids are having sex and learning about sex for the very first times in their lives. So I think hookup culture is causing the sex recession, actually. And to get back to social media is part of how the idea that everyone is hooking up all the time sort of spreads around. And hooking up is so consistent with partying, they don't even have to be talking about hooking up or showing themselves hooking up. All they have to do is indicate that they're going to these parties that are, that is the space in which hooking up happens to give the impression that they are doing college the way they've been taught that they should.
Who's in control here? The media or us, and I think with AI, it's not coming, it's here, so many questions we could continue to delve into. Emmeline, you shared towards the end of your book, this chapter, it's a coda against dissociation feminism, and you say that the rise of the internet as a means of mass communication seems to have opened up a lot of new ways to dissociate. What is dissociation feminism, and how does this play out on the internet?
So basically, dissociation feminism was a term that I kind of came up with in 2019 because I was really kind of trying to understand this sort of kind of ironized and kind of nihilistic and deadpan tone that I found a lot of really intelligent women across all disciplines of art sort of speaking in both online and in books and in films that I was watching at the time. About their sort of very feminized traumas and very feminized forms of pain. And I sort of felt like it was this move kind of away, this sort of Sally Rooney heroine Fleabag era kind of thing where you're sort of seems like there were a bunch of generations of feminists who were screaming and shaking and throwing up and getting in the streets and really trying to do things and we still have these horrible beauty standards and we still have this horrible sexual culture and et cetera. And so there's this subset of women who then were sort of being okay, well, what if I understand politically that I don't believe in that beauty standard or that sexual culture and I disagree with it and I'm gonna but I understand in this sort of kind of both highly individualistic and sort of white feminist way like, I understand that I can succeed with my body and my position in this society by acceding to those norms that I don't politically believe in, and I can sort of have it both ways by doing it in this sarcastic, deadpan tone that makes it clear that I don't want to uphold it, but I can't control the system, little old dainty old me. And so it was like, I wanted to kind of say to those people, and again, like, throughout this book, I'm really trying to, like, look at this, like, emaciated, thin white woman paradigm and neither demonize entirely her nor glamorize her, because I feel like we've tried both of those approaches and it hasn't dethroned her, and instead sort of say I see what you're saying, I understand the impulse to do it, but I don't even think it's going to feel as good as you think it is. And haven't we noticed that most of these sort of like sad white girl icons of our culture over time have actually had their stories end in suicide or alcoholism or depression or whatever? So like, she's not even having that good a time, but also she's seeding these very dangerous messages into our culture. And so I was trying to sort of propose as an alternative this idea that it really resonated with me what you were saying about having the students write diaries and wanting to amplify them, of this kind of feminism of attention where we sort of create more spaces to just listen to each other's stories of the types of pain we've experienced also across a gender spectrum, and also just anybody of being, non-men and like non-super thin people growing up in the society, and sort of say like, what if we just like kind of widened the emotional affect? I'm not saying that like you can never make a gallows humor joke, because sometimes they're funny, but like, what if we also allow for something being said through sobs, something being said haltingly? And so I really wanted to kind of, and in that chapter on the pro-eating disorder forums that we were talking about before, like really like I sourced a lot of my first person stories that I quote in this book from social media, because I think a lot of those voices have been mocked and maligned and like really condescended to, and also just not taken seriously by journalists as like a gold mine of research on psychiatric diseases. Like, people in these forums, people on Twitter, people on Reddit are being so much more honest about their experience than they would be when they're talking to a random journalist. And then even when I was talking to them one-on-one, these people would be like really reticent at first and would be like, look, last time I talked to a journalist that came into this pro-eating disorder forum, they said they were gonna write something to show what's really going on here, and then they made me look insane. And so it's just really complicated, and I really just wanted to make space for like a much wider range of narratives. And I really think that if you ask pretty much anyone honestly and empathically, like, what has nourishing yourself meant to you as it relates to the way that this society receives your physical body and how you move through it, you're gonna have a really cathartic conversation with most people if you actually come at it from this like place of kindness. And I felt like the dissociation feminism was a very like kind of disembodied, like it was a way for a very slim subset of people to escape a double bind, but in doing so, they're also disconnecting from all of their friends and the people they could be communing with by like taking this sort of like bird's eye view of their own life and trying to like make something that is actually very painful into a joke in order to like reap the rewards of a society they don't even believe in. So I was just like, what if we stopped?
Maybe we could do that and
try something
come
else.
fully present, and really dissociation, the anti-dissociation is to sit with those stories, to feel the pain, to know that an emotion has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but we don't usually in our society want to get to the middle, much less the end. I want to kind of start this with you, Emmeline, and pull you in, Lisa. You also talk about the influence of race and racism and this kind of myth of the super thin white woman. If y'all haven't read Fear of the Black Body, it's a wonderful, wonderful book about just kind of the roots of anti-Blackness and how that shaped this kind of image. So can you talk about like how race and racism, how you thought about those things in Dead Weight?
Yeah, so that book is amazing. It's a great source for me as I was doing research. The author's name is Sabrina Strings. So it's like, all my answers are long, but
We love them.
a huge topic, and I'm not going to be able to address it fully and completely here. But I mean, one of the things is, as I've been talking about, there is that stereotype just is not like the thin white girl stereotype is not demographically borne out. Eating disorder data, but often one thing that happens when people of color have eating disorders is that they're often diagnosed far later than white women if they're diagnosed at all, and often they end up misdiagnosed because a lot of Black women suffer from anorexia that goes entirely undiagnosed and end up developing binge eating disorder, as many anorexics do. There's a lot of crossover between these two diseases in the wake of the restriction because your body thinks it's been in a famine and it's really difficult to not crave a binge. And so because Black women are not asked the same screening questions as young white women, they often only get diagnosed when they're on their sort of like second eating disorder. And something I talk about a lot in this book is the way our diagnostic regime creates a really stigmatizing hierarchy, despite the fact that like half of anorexics go on to have binge eating disorder and bulimia, and the same is true vice versa. There's this like hierarchy with anorexia at the top as though it's the like disease where you're just like taking society's dictates too far and you're too good a girl and you're too perfectionist, whereas like the bulimic and the binge eater are cast as like greedy and impulsive and like irrational and very, very like racially coded terms. And so when people of color are only being diagnosed, if they are diagnosed with these more stigmatized diseases, that both makes it harder to access and stay in treatment, and it also just makes people want to talk about it less, and it makes that narrative get a lot less media coverage than the white anorexia narrative. And so that was one sort of myth I really wanted to unpack and talk about. But then we also have, in general, a beauty standard and also a health standard that is rooted in like a long story of racialized capitalism. And in the chapter where I try to get into sort of the wellness industry and orthorexia, which is the new like wellness eating disorder, I try to sort of look back at the Victorian era and when the first time we sort of started seeing proto-health spas in this country, and a lot of the rise of like the first generation of wellness, which was really happening, it's kind of in like the late 1800s, in a way that you'd be surprised by, where everyone was like really freaking out about like the concept of people having like stomach problems, and it was very odd. But anyway, they were like inventing colonics and having all these first health spas and inventing these like vegetable diets and all these extreme wellness things that we now see in our wellness industry as well. But it was all presented as like the duty of white women to better the race and to make sort of thinness and like a functioning digestive system this symbol of whiteness in a very overtly racist way, and also in a very capitalist way that was trying to sell a lot of products, obviously. So I tried to get at those two threads and also just sort of listen to a lot of just stories of people whose eating disorder stories hadn't been listened to, and sort of just like give them space and attend to them in this book, and like use a lot of those people's first person words. It sort of sounds like the same.
Yeah, well, and I think in your book, American Hookup Culture, I mean, you break apart race and what that actually is, what comes to mind when we think about American hookup culture. Can you talk about how you saw race and racism in your research?
Yeah, so across research, it's quite clear that students with various types of privilege are hooking up and enjoying hooking up more than other kinds of students. Students of color in particular tend to get both pushed out and they pull themselves out of hookup culture. There is, of course, a racialized erotic hierarchy that especially puts dark-skinned women down quite low and Asian men down quite low, East Asian and South Asian men. And so it's just not as safe a playground for students of color or for anyone who has a devalued, a physical characteristic or identity. And so we see this data across many, many different studies. But I want to, and then they pull themselves out too, because students of color tend to be more religious and meaningfully religious. They tend to be more interested in studying and less interested in partying, and they drink less alcohol. And in particular, Black students tend to have more gender egalitarian norms. And then they have like cultural ideas that contrast with hookup culture that they can draw on to pull themselves out. But I want to point out that this is also, these racial and other hierarchies are also very structurally embedded in many institutions of higher education. So for example, on any given weekend, on any campus with a Greek system, there is a group of men in a fraternity house. Sororities aren't allowed to throw parties with alcohol for the most part. These men are disproportionately white, heterosexual, wealthy, and these men are throwing a party where they are serving underage drinkers alcohol. The president knows this, the faculty know this, the mayor knows this, the police knows it, you all know this, right? Everybody knows that this is happening, and it is, I'm not saying alcohol's bad, but it is very illegal. And yet they are the only people who somehow we allow to give students this experience. And we dropped the drinking age, or we raised it from 18 to 21 between 1984 and 1987, which threw all this power to the fraternities. Combine that with sororities aren't allowed, and then they just get this free reign to offer this one thing that these underage students have been really taught to want. And that gives this particular small slice, it's not just men, it's a very specific kind of man, of students, all of this power to shape the social and sexual environment that students encounter. And so it's also very much embedded in higher education.
Well, and we're about to go to questions. Just wanted to give you both a chance to share some final thoughts. Emmeline, towards the end of your book, you say, I'm trying to listen, to live here with everyone else stumbling around, trying to open our eyes a little wider and perk our ears up in case a story is being told, one that might change lives. I might be actively unchill and even little bit hysterical, but I'm here and I hope you'll stay. What are both of your wishes for us, when you think about how social media in general kind of shapes our image of ourselves? What are your wishes for all of us? Because you go beyond women who live with disordered eating. You go beyond college students in your book. What are your wishes for us in the future? It's a big question, I know.
Which one of us should go first?
I'll go. I'm not against casual sex, but I do think that the way in which casual sex manifests, given the culture on college campuses, is really harmful and dangerous. And it's harmful and dangerous in the same way that American culture is harmful and dangerous. There's nothing wrong with hookup cultures on college campuses. It's not wrong with the wider society. And so oftentimes, in the same way, we criticize the college students as if they're inventing something that the whole society doesn't endorse, when of course it's all right there. And a big, big piece of it is that we still sort of fail to value and recognize femininity and feminine ways of going about the world and interacting with one another. And so I think that if we're ever going to solve the hookup culture problem, we need to solve these wider problems, which I do argue are sort of secondary to this bigger problem in which we as a society just don't really value one another, or value the earth, or value other countries, and so on and so forth. That's a great answer, and I want to echo everything you said. I think to make it, but on the specific topic of social media, I think I would just hope that there is so much incredibly eloquent and articulate writing on blogs, on Reddit threads, presented in video essay form on TikTok and on YouTube by people that are really struggling and also recognize how this society, to your point, is designed for them to struggle. And so I just would hope that we all sort of listen to them more and are just sort of widening the frame of what kind of media we're consuming. And then, I really think that for so long, people with, especially feminine people with any form of mental illness, are constantly construed as individual failures, or people who are individually not able to hack it, or people who individually misread a society's smoke signals, instead of people who are incredibly smart and just literally read the room they're literally locked into correctly. And we're okay, I guess I'm here, and I will try to find a way to survive. And I think that just really flipping the frame and trying to understand who taught the people that we usually like to demonize the things they learned
who taught the people to feel that way about themselves, and also who taught them these diseased coping mechanisms, and why those were so appealing, instead of sort of demonizing them or saying, oh, that's gross and weird and scary. Like, say, like, why was that the best option? And who's benefiting from that being the best option? And I think once we start looking at those superstructures, we can start to kind of be more of like cogs in the machine, because this machine is kind of, it's not actually that hidden, and it's not even that smart. So, right, it's just so easy to be ground up as gristle, but I do think there's enough of us that care. If you really start having those honest conversations with people, like once you realize how many people this affects, it can be so empowering to realize that if we just sort of do it together.
And to literally shed that dead weight. Can we give Dr. Wade and Emmeline a round of applause and lots of love? I strongly recommend reading these at the same time. It's definitely an experience. We've got some time for questions. So we've got one question. Thank you, Faith, for being our mic runner.
You know, as a parent of boys and girls, we really spent a lot of time, this is for Dr. Wade, we spent a lot of time talking about respecting the opposite sex. And I know that, you know, between the Me Too movement and the whole ideas of consent, do you find that people are asking for consent more in your studies and in writing your book? I mean, what about the Me Too movement? What about, you know, consent now with social media and, like, you know, the instant shaming that people can do? I mean, there must be something to people respecting each other, or at least getting consent. I mean, there must be some information about that. Please, God, please.
I think college students today, at least many of them, are much better at articulating a sort of intelligent and well-educated idea about how to ask for consent. And I hear a lot of parents really trying to like make sure their kids have good heads on their shoulders. But I think what's so important, what is so important, is that when you put a person into an environment that doesn't support having a good head on your shoulders, it's extremely difficult in that environment to make the decisions that are now off script, that they have been taught are right and good. And we're just human beings, and we're taught to respond to our environments, and recognizing the power of the situation, I think, is something that we have a hard time doing because we're such an individualistic society. But many students get into these particular toxic situations, and then they behave in toxic ways because that's what's expected of them in that environment. And it's a lot to ask for them to do differently. So yes, like, they get it, but we still haven't renovated the environments in which they're in a way that allows them to do the thing they know is right.
One question here.
The mother of 15-year-olds who love social media. They're creating their self-image right now, and they are already aware of the hookup culture in college and can't wait to get there. So taking a step back from your experience and your research, what can we do on this small individual basis to prepare our children and to help them see themselves better than what they're being given, and to prepare for toxic situations?
I mean, I think that something that can be really powerful is just like if you go through, like with your teenager, kind of not like, it's not like go through their feed with them, but like just like kind of do that. Like I think it's really can be helpful to like look at what they're consuming. If you're just sort of like, what is your algorithm sort of up to today? Like, what kind of thing are you looking at before you go to bed? And then, like, if you see that it's, like, a lot of one extremely specific beauty standard, if they're open to it, there's, like, you can just be like, well, why don't you follow a few of these other types of accounts? Like, I really just think, like, it's so much about what we take in. Like, if you add diverse bodies into your newsfeed and you make your algorithm know that you want to see that stuff, or you want to see stuff from Project Heal or from Fed Up Collective, or these with various places that I think in the end of the book that do this type of work for diversifying the eating disorder narrative frame, but also just general like fat liberation and diverse body positivity stuff. Like, I do think that type of content like subliminally does get into your mind if you choose to follow it.
And that stuff is really good for our brain. I mean, our brains are soaking in 400 plus years of anti-Black racism, of patriarchy over centuries and millennia. So those images literally flood your eyes if you're sighted with new kind of ways of being. I think we have time for one more question. There was one in the maybe third, fourth row. Yes, right here, Faith. Thank you. Coming to you.
Oh, sweet. Hi, so my question was actually pretty similar. So I'm someone who grew up with social media. I think I got Instagram for the first time when I was 11. And it's a real love-hate relationship. I think it's obvious that it's very damaging to mental health and can reinforce all of these like terrible structures that y'all were talking about. But I also really appreciated that you mentioned that it can have very validating spaces, and like there's nothing inherently wrong with social media. It's all about how we use it, I think. And so I guess what is your recommendation as just a person in the digital age and how to use social media in a way that's healthy?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I said before, but also like, I mean, it's really hard. So I think just like honestly, pairing your consumption of social media with like really kind of attentive consumption of other forms of media and of media, in fact, deconstructing the media you're consuming, you know what I mean? Like, I think it hurts so much less when I see an influencer hawking an appetite suppressant lollipop than it used to, because now I'm mad at like the company that sold it to her instead of at her. And I think that type of sort of shifting of like this like impulse to either like be angry at someone who's making you feel bad about yourself, or like to just sort of like channel a negative emotion at the actual social platform or the corporation or whatever, instead of at somebody else that's being used as a pawn in a different way than you are, I think can make those spaces actually in some ways even illuminating, you know? Like sometimes I feel like I can like learn something and stuff in this book, like I can like think critically about a lot of stuff that I find on social media that in the past would have only harmed me, and now I can use as like analytical fodder to make some other argument. So I think if you sort of like are buttressing your consumption with like enough kind of like an intellectual framework, it can make it so much more empowering to like confront it bravely rather than feel like you don't have any agency, if that makes sense.
And that's the resistance. So everyone in here, we're about to close. I want you to think of one person, you've probably already thought of them, who you want to have a conversation with about this panel. Give me some head nods. And now, don't look at us, look at each other. Seriously, look at each other, look around the room. There's about 100 of us in this room. That's the resistance. Stacey Abrams is writing a whole next third book on AI. It's about to get way worse, but we can get way better in terms of our resistance, right? And so I hope you have those conversations. Let's give them one more round of applause. Thank you so much for the beautiful gift of your books. They're phenomenal.